So, as you know, the source or the roots of our tradition of meditation are in the teachings of the Desert Fathers and Mothers, this movement of Christian contemplative life that began after the institutionalization of the church in the 4th century with Constantine, and as people began to look in a way for a renewal of Christian life and spirituality. And it's always important to remember it was a lay movement, not clericalized. Monasticism became clericalized during the Middle Ages. But at this point, it was very much a lay community or lay movement, very similar to the Celtic monastic movement, which was very heavily influenced, directly influenced, in fact, by the desert tradition. There's evidence of Egyptian monks coming to Ireland in the 5th century and being buried in Kerry with Coptic inscriptions. So Celtic monasticism was always closely in touch with this, with the sort of the grassroots of contemplation. And what happened progressively, of course, was this contemplative wisdom and the teaching that keeps the transmission going became, in the Western Church, of course, more and more marginalized. So the handing on of this tradition is a subtle spiritual event. It is continuous. It is, in a way, the transmission of the gospel. And we're assured by the gospel itself that this will continue until the end of time. But how effectively it continues depends upon the conditions and circumstances of the transmission that's taking place. So it's quite possible the church will shrink to a very small and even beleaguered, persecuted minority, as it has done in the past or in certain parts of the world at certain periods. Or the church could find a way of spreading its good news in a very different, pluralistic, post-religious, secular society by learning to adapt to the language and to the mindset of the new society, the post-Christian or post-Christendom, post-Christian, post-religious society in some ways. So we don't know which way it's going to go or how it will unfold, but certainly there are points of contemplative renewal in the church which give a great deal of hope. And here in France, especially over the last 20 or so years, many new forms of contemplative life and contemplative community have arisen. So what I think we need to be aware of is both the roots of our teaching, of our practice, of our transmission, how from what we passed it on, clearly from the gospel, the teaching of Jesus himself on prayer and upon how to live in the world, but also specifically through the desert tradition and that early monastic tradition. And that early monastic tradition speaks very directly, I think, to people today, and to young people today especially. It's not dogmatic, it's experiential, it's about personal transformation, not about adherence to belief. And it has a vibrancy and a personal character. At the same time, it is authentic, it has a depth and it's challenging. It's not just a sort of New Age spirituality which is just about feeling good. There is a call to a fundamental loss of self and to a gift of self to God. And it brings together also the desert tradition, the two aspects of contemplative experience. One of them is solitude, and the other is community. And both these aspects were expressed in the different lifestyles, or interconnecting lifestyles of the Egyptian desert. Depends how we define community and solitude. If we think of solitude, if we think of them as not two sides of the same coin, but we think of them as opposites and almost irreconcilable opposites, then if we think of them as opposites, I think we lose the wisdom. Paradox brings us into wisdom, so we lose the practical wisdom of how to build ways of transmitting this teaching. In other words, John Main says meditation creates community. What does that mean? What kind of community? He says a community of love, not an institution. But as a Benedictine, he understood very well, as Benedict did, and as the desert teachers did, that community needs organization, needs certain definitions, certain guidelines, certain rules, if you like. So just as a family does, or an office does, or a group of bird watchers organizing themselves, every kind of human organization needs some kind of structure. So, but there's a difference between community organization and institutional organization. But this is happening already in our modern cultural and corporate life. Institutional structures are changing. The idea of leadership is changing. The idea of how businesses should be run is changing. It's being changed by technology, by the way we can communicate so directly. It's also changing because of the understanding of authority that has developed in modern culture. We don't like hierarchy. It's almost it's a bad word, hierarchy. And yet everything does have a hierarchy. Nevertheless, we don't like to think of ourselves being trapped in a hierarchy. So I think what is happening, if you like, in the contemplative life today is reflected in and can influence what is happening in other forms of social organization and business life, corporate life, professional life. And this would only happen because there is a climate in our time of a sense of a need for this contemplative consciousness. It's not that this is a kind of a watering hole we go to at weekends, or a place we just go to recharge our batteries and get a massage and relax and so on. But and of course, any need creates a market, and any market creates products, and products may be good or bad. So often, many of the contemplative products on the market are a little embarrassing when you understand if you understand what contemplation really means. Nevertheless, there is a surge or an awakening of contemplative consciousness, and the sense of the need for us to develop it if we are to solve the problems we're facing, whether at the global level or at at our personal level of psychological mental health. So these two aspects of the contemplative experience, solitude and community, depends what you mean by solitude, depends what you mean by community. But if we think of solitude as going out into the woods here, one of our plans eventually is to build some hermitages in the woods. And there are many people who would like to be able to spend time in the woods, just as there were people who like to go into the caves in the Himalayas or go into the forests in India. So there is an aspect of solitude which calls us into our own space and our own time, where we are in a way coming off the grid, where I think if we had hermitages here, we would confiscate people's cell phones for their own good. No, I don't know if we would do that. We would hope that they would have the self-discipline necessary for it. But it would be a little counterintuitive in a way to go out into that kind of physical solitude with your phone. There are meditation centers where they ask people to surrender their phones except for half an hour in the evening, when they can ask for them and check if they've won the lottery or if everybody's okay at home. So, anyway, physical solitude is one aspect. Physical withdrawal and mental withdrawal is one aspect of solitude, and one that many people feel the need for. There was a priest I knew in New Jersey who built a number of hermitages, and everyone thought he was crazy, in New Jersey, but it's booked up for years ahead, and maybe just for 2 or 3 days, but there is a hunger for this because we are saturated with activity and with noise and meetings and media. But that physical withdrawal is only one small aspect of the meaning of solitude. Any community or any family in which there is a close life needs to respect and to, in fact, demand that the participants, the members, can enter into solitude, not necessarily by going out into the woods, but to have the necessary space and time that is simply part of psychological health, still different for different people. But everybody needs it. But the essence of solitude is not about physical withdrawal. It's essentially about discovering and accepting one's own uniqueness, that each one of us is a unique manifestation of the divine, an image brought into existence through the imagination of God. God who knew us before the world began. That we have existed in God's loving purpose and mind even before there was anything in existence. So to be aware of our own uniqueness, and that's very similar to saying coming to know ourselves, introduces us immediately to a sense of the wonder of our own being, as the psalm puts it. That we are not just an accumulation of problems and knots and hang-ups and personal addictions and craziness, but that we are more than that, and that fundamentally we are a wonderful manifestation of the love of God, the creative love of God. And I think if meditation has a transformative effect upon us, existentially, at the level of pure consciousness, I'm not talking about belief systems, then it's because it does lead us into a lived experience of this depth and wonder of our own being. And that is easy to say, it's easy to write about, but to know it and experience it changes us. Self-knowledge changes us. And it changes us because it makes us aware that although we are unique, we are not alone. That in that uniqueness, we are interrelated, that every other human being and every sentient being and the universe that we belong to and the natural environment and the society and everything that we are part of shows us that we are an interrelated being, which means we don't have to defend ourselves. Increasingly then, as that self-knowledge deepens, you could say that in most people's cases, there might be less need for physical withdrawal, because you would be in solitude, in the true sense, even in the midst of activity and in a crowd. And this is something that some of the great enlightened beings, like Ramana Maharshi, for example, speak specifically about. And it's reflected, again, in the wisdom of the desert tradition. Saint Anthony of the Desert, who was regarded as the sort of archetypal first Christian monk, was converted by listening to the gospel and the call to leave all his possessions behind, which he did. And then he went into the desert, began to live a solitary life, quiet life, and then he became famous, and to avoid the fame and all the people coming to take photographs of him, he moved deeper into the desert and eventually locked himself up in this desert fortress. And there he said to his friends, just bring me some water and dry bread every week. So for 20 years, you might have to take this story with a pinch of salt, but for 20 years, he lived in this extreme solitude, withdrawal, and it was from this period that he went through his temptations, which is one of the great themes of, particularly, well, the themes of Western art, really, the temptations of Saint Anthony, because it gave the artist a lot of scope for imagination of what he was tempted by. So he goes through this turbulent period of temptation and purification, and very intense and serious stuff. Then, after 20 years, his friends think that enough is enough, so they go and open the doors of the fortress, and then he comes towards them. And they're expecting to see him either dead or crazy. But in fact, he walks towards them with a beautiful smile, with a beautiful complexion, neither too fat nor too thin. And he speaks to them very rationally and sweetly. The meaning of which is that all of this asceticism, all of this contemplative practice, intense contemplative practice, has simply produced an integrated, nice person. As the Dalai Lama says, if your religion doesn't make you nice, it's not working. You know? So Anthony emerges from these 20 years of meditation and cold water, physically, mentally, emotionally, psychologically harmonious and human. And the only physical defect he had for these 20 years was that his teeth had been ground down by eating dry bread, which is the point made by the biographer. So then, how does he spend the rest of his life? He goes into the fortress at the age of 35, the Jungian age of the beginning of the inner journey, the midway point in life. It's after this point, I'm not sure if everyone would agree with it, but Jung says from this point on, and not really until then, people begin to, the primary goal of life is more of an interior integration. In any case, so he's 55 now. What does he do for the next 30 years, I think he lives? So we're told. He devotes himself to comforting the sorrowful, reconciling the divided, and what's the third thing he does? Okay. Comforting the sorrowful, reconciling the divided, and teaching, yes. So teaching the truth. So in his new integration, you could parallel this with the ox herding story pictures actually as well, where at the end of the struggle with the ego and the bull, if you remember, the person who's had to tame the bull goes through various trials, and then the penultimate picture in the sequence is just a blank circle. There's nothing in it, so the ego has been destroyed or eliminated. But then there is a next one, which is he comes back into the marketplace to teach. Yeah. And in the same way, the stages of contemplation, which you find on the east portal of Chartres Cathedral, show different stages of contemplation relating to this figure of a woman who's sitting with a book. And at first the book is closed, in the next one it's open, and she begins to read, she begins to take in teaching, and then she integrates it. And the next one is, ecstasy. So she's swept out of herself in ecstasy. And you might think that's the last one, but it isn't. The next one is teaching. So in all the wisdom traditions, we see that contemplative consciousness is achieved, generated by practice, by discipline, by work. In the Christian tradition, contemplation is always seen as a grace, as a gift. It's not something you can get online, you know. You can't go shopping for it online, and you can't see it just as a result of a technique. On the other hand, it's a grace that has to be received. So we have to be in a receptive mode. We have to choose to put ourselves in a receptive modality. That's why St. Teresa says, all that we can do at the time of prayer is to prepare ourselves. But preparing ourselves is a full-time job, or a wholehearted job. So, and this is reflected in John Main's teaching on the mantra. Yesterday, I went through the stages. So the same discipline of the mantra takes us through these different stages, but eventually leads into unified consciousness, or this, let's call it experience of union, as St. Teresa would call it, or experience of contemplation, let's say. But then this experience isn't the end of the journey, but because it begins to integrate all the levels of consciousness. So let's say you begin to put in your second meditation of the day. You will notice a significant change in the way you deal with these other levels of activity and consciousness in your life. And a greater sense of harmony, of integration, and let's put it this way, the sense of the presence of Christ in each moment and activity, however mundane, of your life. And if that happens, or when that happens, and your life begins to become contemplative, you don't just have contemplative moments which you struggle with and to try to do your meditation, but when that rhythm has been introduced into your daily life, the morning and the evening, then you begin to see that your life itself is becoming contemplatively orientated. That means orientated in the present moment and in the presence of God to whatever you are doing and whoever you are with. And it makes life much more interesting, actually, and surprising. When I went into the monastery, everyone said to me, "How could you do that? You know, you have so many things you want to do with your life, and it's going to be so boring." And I thought it would be. I thought, well, then maybe that's the price you have to pay. But I must say, I wouldn't say it has always been blissfully happy, but it has never been boring or meaningless. So that would be true of any way of life. But so if we can build, we don't have to go into a fortress in the desert for 20 years, but if we can adjust our lives around this minimum, I mean, it's a pretty small minimum of the 2 periods of meditation a day, then the transformative effect on our whole life means that there is nothing we are doing then, however mundane, however busy we get, that is in itself separated from those times of meditation themselves, or separated from the conscious sense of connection to the presence of Christ. And the great symbol of that is the breath. St. Anthony of the Desert once called all the monks of the desert to him, and they all came. It took them days to walk across the desert, and when they were all gathered, waiting to hear what announcement he made, it was in 3 words. It was the shortest sermon ever delivered. It was, "Always breathe Christ." Now, that symbol of uniting the breath to our spiritual life is universal too. That's why the word for breath and the word for spirit are the same in many languages. Now, in this teaching of meditation, many people will say the mantra in rhythm with their breathing. You can say the mantra as you breathe in and breathe out in silence, or you can say the first 2 syllables as you breathe in and the second 2 as you breathe out. The important thing is, in this way, is not to tie the breath to the mantra or the mantra to the breath in a rigid way, because clearly the breath is going to slow down during meditation. So, I would say rest the mantra very lightly on the wheel of the breath. The wheel is turning. Doesn't matter how fast. Just rest the mantra on the wheel of the breath in either of those ways, if that's comfortable. But give your full attention to the mantra, saying it, sounding it, listening to it. And then you're not dividing your attention then between the breath and the mantra, because the whole purpose of the mantra is to bring you to a unified, single-pointed consciousness. As it says several times in the New Testament, avoid being double-minded. That sense of division within ourselves, the divided consciousness, the self-conscious, objectifying consciousness. So the purpose of the mantra is, of course, in a gentle but in an irresistible way, to unify ourselves to a single point. And one other way of describing this would be like this, which helped me years ago. So we start off in a pretty divided state. So we start to meditate, but we're doing lots of other things. We have lots of other things we want to do and achieve or be or have fun or whatever. So there is a certain division between what is driving us to meditation and the other drives in our life, whatever they may be. You may want to become president, or you may want to, whatever you want to do. So, but the practice of meditation itself brings this divided consciousness into a process of convergence. This is described, of course, in St. Paul's letter to the Romans. And he describes it in a way that gives a revolutionary new understanding to the idea of sin. Previously, and unfortunately for most of Christian history, sin was regarded as the breaking of laws, rules, regulations, moral or otherwise, moral or religious. And these rules may have been delivered by God on Mount Sinai, the Ten Commandments, or they may have been created by the Church as God's CEO on earth. So in 1214, I think it was the Fourth Lateran Council, the Church decreed that under pain of eternal punishment, of mortal sin and eternal punishment, everyone at the time, had to go to confession to their parish priest once a year. It's an amazing statement that this human organization issues with such confidence this decree of power over the eternal soul. So, this is an understanding of sin that St. Paul vehemently rejects when he speaks about the law and grace and sin. And for Paul, sin is not what you're doing over here, having all the fun that you then feel guilty about, or breaking all the rules that you're supposed to be keeping, okay? While at the same time, being very religious at other times to make up for all of this. But sin does not exist here. Sin is this gap here. This is the gap. The division within the self. What I want to do, I do not do, he says. What I do not want to do, that is what I find myself doing. So it's this personal sense of division and conflict and separation within the self that is the source of, that is the meaning of sin. And then he says, so how does God deal with sin? Not by punishing, which would be the institutional way of controlling people. If you don't do this, you will be punished, or excluded, or excommunicated, or whipped, or burnt. Sin is not punished by God, because as St. Augustine says, sin contains its own punishment. Sin is the punishment. This is the pain. You don't need to punish people because they're in pain. If you go to the doctor and you say, I'm really suffering from very terrible stomach pains, he doesn't kick you in the stomach. So what Paul says is that God responds to this painful human condition of sin by pouring grace in. Where sin is, grace abounds all the more. So the more sin, the more grace we need. So God is not short of grace. So the more grace He floods you with. But of course, grace, it's as if, grace is trying to get in. And it requires, at some moment, a response, or a break, or a breakdown. Sometimes you need to break down in order for the grace to come in. And maybe you could say meditation is the way we have a kind of controlled breakdown. Because what is a breakdown? When your life breaks down and you have a physical or psychological collapse, means you have lost all control. Sometimes in the extreme, you have to be taken away into care. You can't do anything for yourself. You're totally helpless. Well, that's in an extreme. But in a way, we need to have that weakness, that lack of control, in order for grace to come in. But once it's in, it's got its foot in the door, and it will push the door open more and more can come in. And so, what St. Paul also realizes is that sin is not the expression of human pride or human strength or defiance of God. That's a kind of fantasy. But sin is really inseparable from human weakness and vulnerability. God's power comes to its perfection in human weakness, he says. So here's a very different model of the human-divine relationship, and therefore a very different way of understanding the work of prayer. So our prayer is not about trying to ask God not to punish us, or flatter God, or create this image of God, that we play with, that we're supposed to love, but that we really fear. That kind of image of God, which has almost died now. God is dead, according to Nietzsche. So that God is almost dead, but fundamentalists are trying to keep him alive. And it's very attractive in many ways. So that God will never completely die, because it answers a lot of needs. It's a very convenient image of God, especially if you're creating a very institutional church. And there are a lot of people who want to believe it, but it's fake news. And it will always have quite a popular following, just as in populism. I heard a good definition of populism in politics the other day. Populism is when people want to believe the lies they're being told. So they want to believe this crap that they are being fed. So the same thing happens religiously in fundamentalism. People want to believe in this kind of easy duality, easy punishment, good and bad. I'm on the good side. Thank God you're the enemy. I can do what I like to you. I can wipe you out because you're not saved, and so on. It's easy. And then it also justifies the human ego's hierarchy of power. And that's where you find corruption in religious institutions, whether it's sexual corruption, sexual abuse, which is an abuse of power, or whether it's financial corruption in TV evangelists and other sources. So you can basically empower the shadow side of your personality with that kind of image of God. It becomes a big business in our minds and psyches, and we would become totally aligned with that image and that power culture, and it would drag us more and more deeply into itself. And it's demonic. The negation of God becomes demonic. So religion of this kind does become demonic. And it becomes a complete antichrist. The first time that the phrase antichrist is mentioned is in the New Testament, in the letters of John. They'd already begun to see the danger of the shadow becoming institutionalized. We don't know why he used that phrase, I think, but that within the community of believers, this Antichrist can be formed that looks like Christ, sounds like Christ. And as Jesus said in the gospel the other day, don't go following everybody who says, I am the Christ. So all of this can be understood better when we have this model of how prayer leads us from an image of God as outside of ourselves, a projected and constructed image of our own ego, or collective ego. But when we stop praying to that God, and I think a lot of people find that image unacceptable today, but it can always reform. When we stop praying to that image, or even the idea of praying to God, in a sense, then we begin a contemplative journey. St. John of the Cross describes this in his section called The Dark Night of the Soul. And he says, moving from the external forms of prayer and devotion, which can be very satisfying and very enriching and so on, but when you begin to shift your center of consciousness from that form of prayer into contemplation, he said, it's going to be difficult. you will put up, he almost describes it as withdrawal symptoms, because you're leaving a very easy source of satisfaction and fulfillment and consolation and devotional sweetness, but something in you is calling you to something more, to the next stage. But you don't want to go to the next stage. And on the other hand, you don't really want to go back because you know that that's not fully real and it was okay for its time, but you've got to go deeper. So, again, there's a lot of turbulence in this gap or division within ourselves. And if it weren't for grace, and grace manifesting in our love for each other, I don't think we'd ever get there. Or we'd all have to go and lock ourselves up in a fortress for 20 years. So, it becomes a more and more narrow path. Until it reaches a point of convergence. And this point of convergence can be understood from two sides. On one side, it seems like the death of the self, certainly the transcendence or the death of the ego or the disempowerment of the ego. But there is a real death aspect to this. This narrow path has the sense of advent, moving towards something, but it also has the sense of coming to an end. That's why the readings for the last few weeks or so on are all about the end of time, the end of the world, and revolutions and signs and portents in the skies and earthquakes and things coming to an end. And yeah, it is. From this point of view, this is what it feels like. But we keep going into it, because it's like going into the black hole, you can't turn back. Or if you were, you can't really turn back, you just have to go into fantasy, into suspense mode, and just waste another 20 years. But if you keep going, and grace, you keep allowing grace to push you to the next stage, and to keep you persevering, he who perseveres to the end will be saved, then you do come to this point of convergence, and from there is a corresponding expansion. So this is convergence to the single point, and this is expansion into the kingdom of God, into the infinite riches of Christ, as St. Paul calls them. And this happens at all levels and in all dimensions, but it happens in this life. That's why the resurrection, which is this immense outpouring of grace into the human condition, this is why the resurrection isn't about what happens to us after death. It is, but it's primarily about sending us back to live this life in a new way. And that's why you'll find in John Main's teaching, or in the teaching of any of the teachers of the mystical Christian mystical tradition, that the Christ we meet in meditation is not the historical Christ. Of course, the Gospels are important, and the Gospels reveal the risen Christ to us. But we don't meet the historical Jesus. He died quite a long time ago. But we meet the risen Jesus, the risen Christ. And where do we meet him? Well, we meet him and we see him and he disappears, and we meet him in ourselves, we meet him in the beauty of nature. And Simone Weil says, the beauty of the world is the smile of Christ extended through the universe. So if we're tuned in and awakened, and we're able to turn the attention off ourselves for a bit before it comes back, if we keep the attention turned off ourselves, then this encounter with Christ becomes continuous. Always breathe Christ. And that means in every person we meet, there is this feeling of connection. And in every times of meditation, there may be at times more of a sense of dying, but there's always the sense of being in this encounter with new life, and what is calling us to new life. Which is also why John Main says every time we meditate, we enter into the Paschal mystery, into the dying and rising of Christ. So if you spin this little diagram around, of course, you get the cross. And the cross is a paradox, not only of death and life, but of as it were, the spiritual and the material, the heavenly and the earthly, but the paradox or the apparent opposition between these oppositions in life, which are the cause of our suffering and conflict, there is a point of convergence at the center of it. And at the center there is always this dynamic balance, these tremendous forces in us and in the world which create conflict are held in balance and unity here. And in the Christian scriptures, this is focused through the person of Christ. And so in Christ, all of the opposites are resolved. That's why he is our peace. St. Paul says, he himself is our peace. Because in him there is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither rich nor poor, no, he said neither slave nor free, or male or female. The greatest separator, or no yin or yang. So this point of unity is in the contemplative wisdom already present within us in our own center, in our own heart. We simply have to turn towards it, move towards it, and go through the turbulence that's necessary in that process of convergence. And it isn't as if this happens from December until July, and then from July on it's a big expansion. The dying and the rising are working together. At some levels we may be dying, at other levels we may be rising. But overall, there is a direction, and the direction is towards our union in our own personal dying and rising with the death and rising of Christ. So when people ask, is meditation really Christian? Or what does the Pope say about meditation? I mean, this is what we have to be able to answer. You have to be able to answer. Nothing I've said is particularly new. So that's the contemplative church of the future. Be starting from here. And if you start from this point, then you have a church that is prophetic, that stands up and is prepared to suffer, or is prepared to be unpopular, and knows what side to be on in certain conflicts, but also although it knows what side to be on in certain social, political conflicts or questions like the environment or climate denial, climate change denial, on certain of these issues it will know where to take a stand, but it will not be promoting division. Somehow, the Christian, the Christo-centered person, knows how to stand up for the truth without persecuting the people you disagree with, or even trying to defeat them, which is difficult.